211, hosted by the Sandra Day O'Connor Institute for American Democracy. I'm Liam Julian with the O'Connor Institute. Proposition 211, which Arizona voters will see on their November 8th ballots, would amend Arizona law to, quote, require entities and persons spending over $50,000 on statewide campaigns or $25,000 on other campaigns, not including personal monies and business income, to disclose the original donor of contributions over $5,000. It would also create additional reporting and enforcement provisions, unquote. Arguing for the affirmative in favor of Proposition 211 is Mr. Terry Goddard. Mr. Goddard is a former Attorney General of the state of Arizona and a former mayor of Phoenix. He has been a leader in the effort to include Proposition 211 on the ballot. Arguing for the negative against Proposition 211 is Mr. Jon Riches. Mr. Riches is the Vice President for Litigation for the Goldwater Institute's Scharf Norton Center for Constitutional Litigation and General Counsel for the Goldwater Institute. Today's debate will be a modified Oxford-style debate. Both Mr. Goddard and Mr. Riches will present their cases in opening statements, and then each man will have an opportunity to cross-examine the other. Finally, they will both offer closing rebuttals. Then I will be asking questions, some of which will have been submitted by you, the audience. I will also be keeping time. I'll be flexible on time, but not too flexible. And I'm told that I started too early. We missed the first 5 seconds. So hello and welcome. We're having a debate on Proposition 211, and it's hosted by the Sandra Day O'Connor Institute for American Democracy. And without further ado, we'll begin with Mr. Goddard's opening statement.
Well, thank you, Liam, and thank you to the O'Connor Institute for this opportunity to talk about Prop 211, something I care very, very deeply about. My name is Terry Goddard, and I've had the privilege to work now through, 4 different efforts to get what is now Prop 211 on the ballot, so Arizona voters can make the choice as to whether they want to have transparency in election contributions. I represent a group called Voters' Right to Know. It's a nonpartisan coalition of grassroots organizers and grassroots activists and business leaders here in Arizona who have basically come together because they care about our political system. They believe that it's in serious trouble today, and that transparency, while not the be-all or end-all, it doesn't fix all of the ills, but it can do a lot to make our political system more open, more honest, more and less of a vicious contact sport, which is what we've been seeing. I can't say that passing Proposition 211 is going to instantly bring the temperatures in Phoenix down below 100 in August, but I do think that it will do a great deal to make politics in Arizona back to what I remember in the early days that I was working, where there was more of a collegial dialogue and less of the vicious attacks. So we think we can do something about that. It's a simple message. Basically, what Prop 211 stands for is if any individual or corporation is going to try to persuade the voters one way or the other through paid advertisements, they need to say who they are. It's that simple. They need to say who the sponsor is, who the original check was written by, and not hide behind what we call dark money shields, a series of legal artifices which make it impossible for the press or the ordinary voter to know who it is that's actually paying for the ad. You get these silly names. I use Americans for Peanut Butter as an example, but I think you know what I'm talking about. There are so many of these deceptive names that represent ways to hide the people who are really paying for the ad. So that's our message. We think it has some very, very, well, I should also say that another way of putting what it is we're trying to do is in basically the preamble to our act that's proposed for the ballot as Prop 211. And it basically says Arizona voters should have the right to know the original source of all funds used to influence their vote, to persuade them to go one way or the other. It's that simple. So what are the benefits? I think there are at least three, and they're big ones. The first one is transparency. Transparency, I think, is an end in itself in politics. There are tremendous virtues to knowing who it is you're debating against or who it is that you are being influenced by. And it allows, when you know who it is that's paying for the ad, the voter can evaluate the message that's being sent. And it's that simple. It is the ability to say, okay, here's what they're telling me, and here's who's telling me, and here's why I think they're saying that. And that goes back into Arizona history, back when Arizona Public Service tried to influence the vote back in 2014 for the Corporation Commission. Nobody knew that it was their friendly neighborhood utility that was spending millions of dollars to try to get two candidates elected. Two candidates who, when they got in the office, voted for very large rate increases. The second item that I think is so important is just basic fairness. I mean, people who make political contributions in Arizona have to, if it's over $50, they have to disclose who they are, where they live, who they work for. And right now, Mr. Riches and others are trying to say that there should be a few folks who get special privileges. And one of our supporters, may surprise some in this audience, is former Governor Fife Symington. He and I have joined together in this effort, conservative, liberal, Democrat, Republican. And one of the things that he said in his statement of support was the contributions of ordinary citizens are capped and are a matter of public record. Yet a few organizations and individuals are protected from declaring their donations. It's time to end that. This initiative will do that. So that's the fairness side. And the last one is a little more subjective, and that's the idea of civility. Right now, dark money, anonymous cash, buying advertisements to persuade voters does not have any accountability. Essentially, you get a silly name, Americans for Peanut Butter, which is in the disclaimer, and you don't know who's really behind the ad. So that individual, that person, or that corporation is hiding. And because they're hiding, because they're not accountable for what's said in the ad when it ultimately airs, they have no responsibility. They have no accountability. And so the folks who are placing the ads can say and do anything. And I'm afraid that's exactly what they do. They do whatever they think is necessary, be it false or disparaging to the other side that they're trying to beat. And they say it without repercussions because they have no reputation to protect. It's only the original donor that does. So I think we can do so much to improve our Arizona politics by this simple mechanism of requiring everybody, not just the majority, but everybody who tries to influence the vote one way or another to say to the public who they are. And we think that will have the advantages of greater confidence for the voters about that their vote really counts. It'll level the playing field so that we don't have unfair treatment for some contributors, but not for others. And last, and I think certainly very important, it will provide accountability in the advertising space, which does not exist today for the massive millions of dollars which are spent from dark money sources. So that's my pitch. I hope that you will support Proposition 211, and I'd be, if not delighted to hear what Mr. Riches had to say, I'm certainly anxious to hear why we shouldn't have transparency in Arizona elections.
Thank you, Terry. Mr. Riches?
Well, thank you, Liam, and thanks to the O'Connor Institute, and thanks to Terry for having this conversation. I think it's a crucially important one. I want to start with a little bit of history because this issue has come up since the beginning of our republic, as it turns out. And specifically, I want to go back to the 1950s, where an issue advocacy group wanted to provide legal support and financial support to college students. They wanted to solicit donors. They wanted to help organize boycotts. And at the time, the Alabama Attorney General didn't like what they were doing. And so he went to court and he sought an order to compel this organization to turn over the names of its members. And the organization objected because they thought that they had a First Amendment right to privacy in their associations. Case makes it all the way up to the United States Supreme Court, and in a unanimous opinion, the United States Supreme Court agrees. And in striking down the Alabama Attorney General's attempt to get the membership list of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the court reiterated a fundamental principle under the First Amendment. That is the right of all of us to privately associate and not report those associations to the government. So I want to spend just a couple minutes defining what we're actually talking about. Terry used the phrase dark money. Well, under this initiative, this would apply to any organization that communicates with the public and even mentions a candidate or engages in an issue or talks about an issue that is important to them. So depending on where you draw the line, what this means is that donations made to the ACLU or Planned Parenthood or the Sierra Club or the NRA or to a local church or to a neighborhood soup kitchen can be disclosed to the government. And that includes, if we were to look at this nationally, over 1 million 501c3 organizations, schools, churches, hospitals, art centers, public radio stations, research, education associations. It includes the Sandra Day O'Connor Institute. And these range ideologically from the NRA to the ACLU to everything in between, which is why this is not and has never been and would never be a partisan issue. This is an issue about the First Amendment to the United States Constitution. So when Terry uses the phrase dark money, another way to think about it is government mandated disclosure of names, addresses, and employers of donors to charities. And I think we'll hopefully have an opportunity to talk about why it's even in the interest of any government interest whatsoever to get a donor's employer and their personal address. I also want to talk really briefly about what the problem the purported problem this is trying to solve is. So in 2020, which was a banner year for political elections, there was $14 billion spent on federal elections. By the way, Americans spend about $10 billion on Halloween every year. But there was $14 billion in federal elections. Of that, $750 million came from organizations that don't report their supporters to the government. So that's less than 5%. And that's historically been the case. In 2016, it was even less than that. It was 3%. So that means that virtually all of the real money in actual political campaigns is already reported to the government. So why is this specifically a problem? There's three reasons. The first, I think, is crucial. If we allow the government to compel the employers and the names and the addresses of individuals donating to charities, there is a real and legitimate fear of retaliation against those speakers from others who might disagree with what they're speaking about. The second is this prevents public discourse from focusing on the message, and it focuses it on the messenger. So Terry had talked about civility as a virtue in our political system, and I agree with that 100%. This increases in civility. It increases the attacks on the individual and removes the focus on the message. And third, and this is crucial as well, it muddles regulations so that nobody really knows what's permissible, what's prohibited. And when that happens, regular Arizonans are going to refrain from speaking, and it results in less free speech. So to the first point, associations that engage in important issues should be free to do that without fear of harassment and intimidation. This measure requires a donor to a nonprofit, whether it's the Sierra Club or Planned Parenthood, to disclose the donor's name, mailing address, occupation, and employer to the government for having made that donation if that organization then engages in issue advocacy. And we've seen throughout history, obviously the civil rights era, governments attempt to do this when they don't like particular speakers. In fact, John Adams did it with the Sedition Act going back to 1798. But even more recently in an age of doxing, when people fear people showing up at their homes, intimidating them. We saw it in Milwaukee, where the Milwaukee County District Attorney didn't like a political opponent and went after his nonprofit, engaged the criminal law to have police kick down his doors. Rep. Joaquin Castro tweeted out the name of Trump voters ahead of a Trump visit so that those businesses could be protested. So I think the viewers should be asking, what if a supporter of Planned Parenthood, for example, worked at a church, and under Terry's measure, his name, his employer, his address is now released to the government, which is then released to the public? What's going to happen to that person? Or what about a 501c3 that engages in human rights work and is talking about all the problems in China? Well, now maybe that person's life is in danger, or that of his family, when that information is public, all for engaging on a subject he or she cared about. Second, it's important for our debate to focus on the message as the primary issue, particularly when we're talking about issue advocacy. Our Constitution was debated among pseudonyms, where James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay used pseudonyms because, of course, of regional rivalries at the time would have made it so that people wouldn't have listened to them if they had not done that. So I don't think it's not really a stretch to say that our Constitution would not have been ratified had it not been for the ability to engage in discourse using synonyms. And of course, this is true with the news media. Oh, thank you. Finally, donor disclosure mandates are bad because we don't know what's permissible and what's prohibited. Under this measure, campaign media spending includes supporting a candidate within 6 months of an election or even mentioning the candidate's name. So that means that if the Sandra Day O'Connor Institute, which is a 501c3, organized a debate just like this one at this very time, and one of the debate speakers mentioned a political leader that happened to be an incumbent running for office, that could potentially subject this organization to have its donors disclosed. So if you want less free speech, more harassment, and an uglier political discourse, I think that this is the right measure. But if you want people to freely be able to support the causes they believe in without fear of harassment and retaliation, then this is not the measure to support.
Thank you, Mr. Riches. At this point, Mr. Goddard will have a few minutes to ask Mr. Riches some questions.
Well, I'm unfortunately tempted to ask Jon Riches if he read our proposition, because most of the things he just listed as a parade of horribles are not, in fact, a problem for the voters, and I'll be happy to talk about that in rebuttal. But let me start by simply saying that late in his life, I got to know Barry Goldwater and got to admire him terrifically. He used to call me as mayor of Phoenix and say that he was mad to Paradise Valley about the water pressure in his house up on the hill, and he wanted to be annexed into Phoenix again. So that was the kind of relationship we had. And the thing that I took away from that, among other things, was that Barry believed first and foremost in individual responsibility. He believed that you said what you meant and you took the consequences if there were consequences. You stood up for what you believed. I don't understand how, and this is my question, the organization that today bears his name can basically be in favor of secrecy, of hiding the ball, of making political discourse something that is conducted by anonymous players who are simply standing in for the folks who are actually paying the bill. It seems to me, in the words of former Justice Scalia, that does not resemble the home of the brave or the country that Barry Goldwater dreamed of.
Barry Goldwater was first and foremost a supporter of the United States Constitution, and he would oppose any government scheme just like this one that sought to do violence to the Constitution. Terry's conflating two concepts. Transparency is for the government. Privacy is for citizens. And our United States Supreme Court has said time and time again that citizens have a First Amendment right to associate with one another and to have privacy with those associations. We're not talking about political contributions. All of that is already reported to the government. We're talking about issue advocacy among nonprofit organizations that care and support about causes, and they should be free to do so without having to report their support to the government.
Mr. Goddard, you've got about 45 seconds for another question and answer.
Well, I probably can't do anything in 45 seconds. I just believe, well, I'm mixing up rebuttal with the questions. I understand that. But it seems to me that Barry Goldwater would have been a strong supporter of what we're proposing here in terms of individual standing up for what they believe in and not trying to hide behind a bunch of legal barricades, which constitute the dark money shield. So I guess my last question for Mr. Riches is exactly what is it? What could you describe those corporations or individuals who are so intent upon staying secret that they would oppose this proposition?
I think it's everyday Americans. I think it's everyday Arizonans. We are seeing in the news time and again. We saw a woman get fired in California who worked at a restaurant because she opposed a ballot initiative. We're seeing doxing occur just across the board with just this terrible level of violence for people who are just simply trying to express a view on an issue. And this increases that. This increases the vulnerability of everyday Arizonans. And, maybe not everybody's as tough as Barry Goldwater. Barry Goldwater certainly would not have supported this, but maybe everybody's not as tough as him or as Justice Scalia. And maybe they're fine publishing, speaking out, but not everybody is.
Thanks.
Who are those people? Because the ordinary citizen.
All right. I'm sorry, Mr. Goddard.
Go right
sorry.
ahead. I'll leave it for rebuttal.
But you'll have an opportunity because at this point, Mr. Riches is going to ask Mr. Goddard some questions.
One question I have in looking at the initiative is your disclosure requirements require the disclosure not only of the name of a supporter to an issue advocacy organization, but their address, their occupation, and their employer. In an age where people are showing up at the homes of elected leaders and judges, and even people engaged in just normal issue advocacy, what is the purpose of requiring an employer? And don't you think it's dangerous to require individuals who support causes they believe in, whether it's the Sierra Club or Greenpeace or the NRA, to be safe in doing so?
Well, when you talk about conflation, you're conflating issue advocacy with advertising for a political point of view. And that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about the individual who puts money down and presents their opinion in the public marketplace of ideas, but doesn't want anybody to know who it is that's paying the bill. And that's what we stand against. And most Arizonans stand against it. But I don't understand your question in that right now, if you or I give a contribution to a political candidate of over $50, the law has required and has required for many years that we give our name, our home address, our employer, our occupation, and if we're retired, say retired. So what we're asking for here is quite simply the same rules should apply to all donors to political causes, not just the general public, but the very special group of large corporations and wealthy individuals that you seem to be standing up for here.
I assume you would concede that your organization, your initiative is so broad, refers to any public communication that even refers to a candidate. What would you say to the supporter of Planned Parenthood that might work for a religious organization, and maybe she believes, maybe she's pro-choice and wants to support that cause, but now her name is going to be published on a government list? What would you tell that donor to that nonprofit?
Well, in the first place, as if you had carefully read our proposition, I think you would know that the only disclosure is for money that directly goes to pay for political ads. And that has to go with the permission of the individual who's making the contribution. And so there are two very large obstacles before the person you're talking about would be disclosed at all. Plus, they would have to give more than $5,000 in an election cycle. So I don't think the average worker is likely to do that. We tried to craft this very specifically, very carefully, so that we went after knowledgeable contributors who knew that their names would be disclosed. They have the opportunity to opt out if they think that would be inappropriate. And it only applies, not as you have said in your presentation, to all contributors to a nonprofit. The idea that it would there's a specific exception for debates. So the example you gave of the O'Connor debate naming a candidate, then requiring disclosure is just absurd. That's specifically ruled out in the proposition. But the main thing we're trying to do, and I think it's critically important, is to make sure that the voters in Arizona know who it is that's behind the ads that they're listening to. Right now, they do not have that opportunity. And I think unlike a juror in a trial who gets to see what's behind the various witnesses, the jurors get overwhelmed with dark money ads, and that's just wrong.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Goddard. At this point, we'll be doing the rebuttals. I'd like to encourage our audience, if you have any questions, now would be a great time to put them in the comment section, and we'll ask questions at the end. And also with the rebuttals, I think if you need an extra minute, Mr. Riches and Mr. Goddard, we're good on time. We can stretch that out for up to 5 minutes. So, Mr. Riches, your rebuttal.
Oh, thank you. I want to get back to a point that we were discussing briefly earlier in terms of the sort of spending that occurs. So some of the largest groups I think that Terry might be concerned about would be C4 groups, but also C3 groups. The Sierra Club, for example, is one of the largest C4 organizations in the country. All of these groups already report their spending on candidates. So if the Sierra Club supports candidate X, that's already reported to the government. And is there any question among the voters as to what the particular issues are that are important to that candidate if they see on campaign finance disclosure statements, for example, a donation from the Sierra Club? I don't think we got a good answer, unfortunately, to this problem of retaliation. If ever there was a time for us to be intelligent and careful about our political dialogue, it's now. People are so hyper-focused in attacking the speaker physically in many cases, and threats of violence, that if ever there was a time to proceed with caution when we're talking about political or policy discourse, it's now. There's also this issue here where Terry, I think, tried to describe the measure as not doing and doing certain things. I would encourage all of the viewers to go back and read this very extensive measure, what it does do, what it doesn't do, what it's very unclear as to what it does. There was a case, I'll give you a quick example, about 10 years ago in Arizona, where a woman who lived out in Fountain Hills sent an email to 23 of her friends because she opposed a ballot initiative that the town was going to consider. She didn't want the town to accept more debt. She sent an email to 23 of her friends and said, hey, let's get together and protest this ballot initiative. And the town said, no, what you're doing is you're a political committee, much like I could see the Clean Elections Commission saying that if you put on a internet post where you mention an incumbent, you've now engaged in campaign media spending, which is the exact language from the ballot. And she sued and she said, look, all I'm doing is communicating with people. And frankly, I can't even understand what you mean when you say I'm a political committee. Well, this went to federal court, and the federal court struck down the 183-word definition of political committee, where the judge held that in this case, it is not clear that even a campaign finance attorney would be able to ascertain how to interpret the definition of political committee. And he went on to talk about the effect that would have on free speech and striking down that measure. This measure is so broad. It is so over-inclusive. It's so vague in so many ways, where it would capture an internet post that mentioned an incumbent leader 30 days prior to an election, that it is going to sweep in an enormous amount of protected First Amendment activity. And it's not going to alert citizens as to what they can or can't do. And what happens when people don't know, well, is this permissible? Is this prohibited? They refuse to speak. And if ever there was a time when we should be encouraging more discourse, it's now. But this discourages discourse. It chills speech. and it doesn't allow anybody to know what the rules of the road are.
Thank you, Mr. Riches. Mr. Goddard, your rebuttal.
Well, thank you. John, I'm disappointed in your argument. The time you spent on the Fountain Hills case is totally irrelevant here, because the only thing Prop 211 applies to is paid political advertising, money that is spent specifically to persuade the voters. So the items that you have described simply would not be covered under this proposition. It is aimed at large contributors. That's why there's a $5,000 threshold, so that any small contributor to a cause, whatever that cause might be, whatever that nonprofit might be, is not disclosed. So all your talk about the message is frankly irrelevant. And the bottom line here is, and I think everyone who watches politics is well aware, that it's not the message, it's the power that is put behind it that ultimately wins elections. And it's that huge sweep that we in Arizona have seen, tens of millions of dollars of dark money, 10 million just by Arizona Public Service back in 2014. If the voters had known that the utility that was regulated by the Corporation Commission was the one trying to get them to vote in a particular way, I think they would have had a very different conclusion than the one that they ended up having. So that's basically what we're talking about. We're talking about making sure that the voters have the right to know who is trying to persuade them one way or the other in a political contest. And that is just basic fairness. It's the rule that applies to 99% of all the contributors in Arizona, but you want it not to apply to certain wealthy individuals and corporations who can hide behind these dark money shields. And the shield is a funny name. I use American for peanut butter because, as far as I know, that one doesn't exist. But it's the kind of non-statement about what is being advocated for or against that these 501c4 names indicate. In Arizona, we have Americans for Prosperity and the Free Enterprise Club. Those are real organizations that spend real money trying to persuade Arizonans to go one way or the other in the political contest. What do you get from that? I agree with you. Sierra Club gives you a good idea as to what they stand for. So does the NRA. Some of the C4s, frankly, are pretty clear about what their motives are, but that's by no means the ones that we are most focused on. The Sierra Club, by the way, is a C4. They do endorse Proposition 211. So they understand, as you apparently do not, that it would only be applied to disclosure for money that went specifically for a political advertisement. And I would like to close with the words of former Justice Antonin Scalia, because I think he put it as well as I've ever heard it put. He said, "There are laws against threats and intimidation and harsh criticism, short of unlawful action, is a price people have traditionally been willing to pay for self-governance. Requiring people to stand up in public for their political acts fosters civic courage, without which democracy is doomed. For my part, I do not look forward to a society which, thanks to the Supreme Court, campaigns anonymously, hidden from public scrutiny, and protected from the accountability of criticism. This does not resemble the home of the brave." That was Justice Scalia on the issue of disclosure. And I think he got it exactly right. We in this democracy stand up for what we believe. We stand up for what we advocate, and that should apply to contributors for massive amounts of political advertising. And to meet your issue about people being harassed, I'm as concerned about that as anybody. This act has a specific safety valve, which basically allows someone who believes that they or their family would be intimidated or threatened or harmed physically, can go to the Citizens Clean Elections Commission, which would be the folks administering this statute if it's passed by the voters, and ask for an exemption for themselves and their family. We also put the cutoff, the threshold, at a very high level, because we didn't want to bring a lot of people into the only the ones who can defend themselves, frankly, are $5,000 or larger contributors. So, and then the last point that I think is critically important is those contributors have the opportunity to opt out. The person who is going to spend the money or would like to spend the money is required to tell the donor
20
that
seconds.
their name may be disclosed. And that donor has the opportunity to say, well, I don't want my name disclosed. I don't want my money to go for political advertising. Use it for something else. Use it for one of your other charitable purposes, for administration, for some other way that I can help your charity, but not for political advertisement that either attacks or defends a proposition. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Goddard. We have some questions now from the audience. This is for Mr. Goddard. Mr. Goddard, this proposition is labeled voters' right to know. Can you explain philosophically why voters have a right? In other words, what is the basis, naturally, constitutionally, for this right? And how do you adjudicate one's interest in disclosure when it clashes with another's right to privacy?
Well, as I've said, I don't believe that there is a right for a donor to a political campaign. We as individual citizens have a right to privacy, of course. But the Supreme Court has said on many instances that once you decide to pick up the trumpet of political advocacy in the media, then there's a different requirement. And Justice Kennedy, in a case that is widely cited as the beginning of the dark money parade, was quite eloquent, saying that he believed that the First Amendment protects political speech, but disclosure permits citizens and shareholders to react to the speech of corporate entities in a proper way. This transparency enables the electorate to make informed decisions and give proper weight to different speakers and messages. That's what we're talking about. That's the right we're talking about. And Justice Kennedy in Citizens United absolutely turned down the idea that somehow the requiring disclosure was a violation of the First Amendment. There is no First Amendment right to hide if you're a political contributor.
Thank you. This question is for Mr. Riches. Mr. Riches, do you believe our democracy benefits from political attack ads, no matter the funding source? If so, why? If not, what responsibility do the funders of political ads bear?
No, I think the fact that so much of our discourse focuses on attacking the person rather than engaging on the issues is a real problem. And unfortunately, it's a problem that would be made worse by Mr. Goddard's measure. If people are concerned about character assassinations or ad hominem attacks that have nothing to do with policy or political discourse that doesn't focus on the issues, well, then this is precisely a measure you should support. Because now what's going to happen is supporters to nonprofit groups like the Sierra Club or Planned Parenthood or the NRA are going to have their names posted on a government website with their employers so that they will be subject to those same exact attacks. On the other hand, if there's engagement on issues, is there any question, for example, what the Sierra Club stands for, the issues it addresses? Of course not. But if we want to focus on those issues, let's focus on those policy issues, not on attacking people that want to support causes they believe in, and they want to do so anonymously. Mr. Goddard mentioned an older case. The United States Supreme Court just this past term has reiterated what it said for 60 years. So going back to the 1950s, the court said, quote, compelled disclosure of membership in an organization engaged in advocacy of particular beliefs is the equivalent of a requirement that adherents of particular religious faiths or political parties wear identifying armbands. In 2021, the California Attorney General, at the time, Kamala Harris, now the vice president, tried to do a pretty similar thing to what Mr. Goddard is trying to do here. She tried to get the Schedule B forms of every nonprofit organization in the state. And the Schedule B is where charities report donors at the same threshold that Mr. Goddard's initiative does. And an organization in California sued. It made its way up to the United States Supreme Court. And just last year, the United States Supreme Court struck this down as an inappropriate impairment of First Amendment rights. And if you care about the First Amendment, this is certainly not a measure that advances that or our constitutional principles.
Could I respond on that?
Sure, 30 seconds.
Thank you. Well, you're saying that Justice Scalia, Justice Kennedy don't care about the First Amendment. I think that's absurd. And in floor debates in the Senate, John McCain, our senator from Arizona, basically said, and this goes to the question, which asked about attack ads. John said that one of the ways that we could bring down the temperature and increase and get rid of the attack ads was to require full disclosure. He was always a strong proponent of exactly what we're talking about here today. So the question was about attack ads. I think there's no question that dark money fosters them because it separates the donor from accountability for what's said in the ad. And therefore, the individual who's putting on the ad has no reputation to protect and will say and do anything. And unfortunately, that's what they do. They attack.
Thank you. Mr. Goddard, you had spoken earlier about civility being sort of a result of Proposition 211 and enhanced civility. We have certainly some real-life examples of how disclosure of donor information can lead to incivility. I'm wondering, what are the real life examples that you are drawing on to believe that Proposition 211 will enhance civility?
The real life example starts in 2014 with the Arizona Corporation Commission race, where a nonprofit dark money operation, I believe it was the Arizona Free Enterprise Club, sponsored a series of attack ads on first Vernon Parker and his running mate, the Republicans. They laid them to waste, and Vernon Parker is still a strong advocate for disclosure because of his personal disagreeable and extremely almost career-ending attacks that were laid against him. Then later, despicable ads were placed by the same entity against Sandra Kennedy, who was the then sitting commissioner. She was defeated in that election. But Sandra's a courageous woman, and she came back and was elected to the Corporation Commission later and demanded from Arizona Public Service the specific amounts of what they had spent in the 2014 election. It took 5 years to get that information. But when they got it, they found out that $10.3, I believe, million had been spent on attack ads against those candidates by dark money forces. And that's the kind of despicable result. And I know I want to be very clear. APS has now said they will never do that again, and they're not going to be involved in Corporation Commission races. So I think they've moved away from a very dark period in their past. But the bottom line is the lack of accountability in dark money spending leads directly to the kind of attack ads and vicious defamatory statements which we have seen way too often in Arizona politics.
Just real quick to that point, Liam, if you don't mind, using the example of a government-conferred monopoly is frankly not compelling. We're not talking about, when you're talking about APS, you're talking about a government-conferred monopoly with government-granted monopoly privileges. That is not anything at all like private citizens who are organizing to support or oppose causes they believe in. And at the end of the day, essentially what you're saying is we want to protect politicians' sensitivities over our citizens' First Amendment rights. And when I balance the equities here, they fall on the side of the First Amendment, not on the side of politicians' sensitivities.
Liam, there is no right to hide in the Constitution. I hope I've made that clear.
Thank you.
The act of giving a political contribution is not a protected First Amendment right. It's an action of political attack, and it needs to be accounted for.
And here with the conflation again, I'll just let me read a provision. Campaign media spending under Mr. Goddard's Act includes a public communication that refers to a clearly identified candidate within 90 days before a primary election, all the way up into the campaign. That means any organization, anywhere, that mentions an incumbent candidate is subject to your measure. That is not a campaign contribution. That is people talking about issues and political leaders. Nothing like what you're describing.
And the disclosure that we trigger does not start until certain thresholds are met, and is only applied to the money that's spent on political ads. So it's not all of the money going, as you have said wrongfully, it's not all the money going to a particular charity or nonprofit. It's just the money that's spent. And what we're saying in the bottom line is, in this democracy, it's important to know who the speaker is. And so you can evaluate the message. That's all we're saying.
I guess it's okay to violate some people's First Amendment rights, but not others.
No, you're saying that the folks that you're advocating for, and I'm not real clear as to who they are, should have a special right in Arizona not to be disclosed, whereas every one of the rest of us who give political contributions are fully disclosed in exactly the way that you find so objectionable. So what is the reason that you think that there should be a small group who are major spenders in the political realm, but they should get special privileges? I just don't buy that.
Well, unlike you, we're not drawing those lines. We think that the First Amendment applies to everybody. We think it applies to people like Margie Christofferson, who lost her job by making a contribution on a ballot initiative. We think it applies to John Cochner, who was fired from his job in West Virginia because he refused to make a political contribution to his boss's preferred candidate. That's who we care about. The First Amendment applies to all of us. We don't do the line drawing that your measure tries to do.
No, the Supreme Court has said very clearly that political contributions are not speech in the sense that you're using it. And so you're the conflator. You're basically trying to say that a proposition that goes after only one thing, and that is that you take responsibility for the advertisements that you're paying for. And that is, I think, simple. I think people in Arizona understand it and have been very, very supportive of this proposition because they think it's basically fair and needed to increase the civility in our political discourse. And the kind of dark money we have today has led to the viciousness of the ads in our political arena. And that's unfortunate. It's wrong and it needs to stop. As Vice said.
Probably would have been cold comfort to the NAACP in the civil rights era. Could very well be cold comfort to people who support Planned Parenthood or the NRA or any number of controversial issues today.
Thank you. I think that was a useful back and forth. Thank you. We'll move on to another question, though. And this will be for both of you, Mr. Riches, Mr. Goddard. I guess we'll start with Mr. Riches because he's sort of larger on my screen right now. That's why we're doing it that way. Are political attack ads ever okay? And if they are okay, what is the purpose of disclosing the donors? Would it be to attack the donor as well, boycott the donor's employer? What do you see? And this again is for you, Mr. Riches, and then Mr. Goddard. I'll let you answer as well. What are the unintended consequences of Proposition 211?
Are political attack ads okay from a constitutional perspective? Sure. Are they seemly? Probably not. But they're a reality. They're going to exist whether or not this measure passes. In fact, they'll probably increase if this measure passes for the reasons I articulated, because it's less focused on the message. It's more focused on the messenger. So I think that's an unfortunate reality, but it's made worse by this initiative. And I'm sorry, was there a second part, Liam?
No.
Let me pull the question up. Yeah. Essentially, what are the unintended consequences was the second part of the question. Yeah. So
for really the reasons that we articulated, the first and most troubling is disclosure to charities, to the million or so nonprofits that exist in this country, is going to result in harassment and retaliation. And even if it doesn't, and we know we have multiple examples of that happening throughout the country, it's going to end up chilling speech because people are going to be concerned that it will. The second is it forces people to focus on the person rather than what they're talking about, and that doesn't improve discourse. That makes it worse. And the third is this is so vague and overbroad. Organizations aren't going to know what's permissible and what's prohibited. And if you don't know the rules of the road, and when it comes to the First Amendment, when it comes to free speech, the rules of the road have to be clear. People are going to refuse to speak. And I think that's the last thing that we need.
Thank you, Mr.
Well,
Goddard.
just because you repeat something over and over again, John, doesn't make it true. This does not apply to charitable contributions. It only applies to payments to buy political ads. And the disclosure is only for those contributions that are attributable to those ads. It's that simple. It's that clear. And in terms of consequences, I use one word, and it's accountability or responsibility. In other words, if Arizona Public Service had to put their names on the bottom of those attack ads against Vernon Parker and Sandra Kennedy, they never would have done it because they have a reputation to support in the community. And the kind of attacks, the scurrilous attacks, largely defamatory and untrue, that were made because they were able to hide their involvement, could not, and I believe would not have been done by a legitimate company in the community if they had their name put behind it. The same is true of individuals. We all know from the internet, if an individual is participating anonymously, the tendency to be vicious and attack and be irresponsible is very high. When you put your name on the emails, you become much more responsible. And that's what we're asking for here. We're asking for responsibility in the political discussion in the political marketplace.
Mr. Goddard, the question is, are political attack ads ever okay? Are they ever okay?
If they're true, I think it's hard to say that they couldn't do them. I agree with Mr. Riches on that. There is a right to speak that is being exercised, but they are also, they tend to boomerang. I think very often people look at the attack ads and say, well, whoever's behind that, I don't want to be part of it. And that's why I think so many of the dark money contributors want to stay deep in the shadows, because they'd like to have the attack ads, but they don't want to have the responsibility for being behind them. And what we're trying to do is to get rid of that artificial shield, to make sure that they have to stand out in public, as Barry Goldwater would have advised, as Justice Scalia clearly advised, as John McCain clearly advised, as Fife Symington is clearly advising. Stand up, say what your piece is, take the consequences if that's necessary. But that's what we do in our democracy. We evaluate a message based upon the content of the message and who is delivering the message. And without that ability, without knowing who it is that's delivering the message, the voters cannot make a knowledgeable choice. And they know it. That's one of the reasons there's so much feeling right now that voters are disenfranchised, because they hear all these messages and they have no idea where they're coming from.
Mr. Riches, just to follow up on what Mr. Goddard is saying there, do you disagree with that idea that in order to fully evaluate a message, one should be aware of the messenger?
I think that's sort of a cynical view of the American voter. People are in this
position. If you were to write an op-ed for a newspaper, you wouldn't be able to write it anonymously. I think that the newspaper would believe that its readers needed to have the information of who was writing the op-ed to help them evaluate the information in it. Do you disagree with that?
No, it happens all the time. I mean, imagine a law, and this is kind of tantamount to what we're doing here, that said editorials, which are anonymous, editorials that expressly advocate for the election or defeat of candidates, which charitable nonprofits don't do. If there was a law that required the disclosure of those people, or maybe even the people who purchased.
Well, the editorial is written by the editorial board of the newspaper in question.
Right. And oftentimes these are anonymous bylines. The media relies on anonymous sources all the time. For example, Deep Throat, the person who exposed the Nixon campaign, his identity wasn't exposed until 30 years after Nixon's resignation. So obviously there is a value to anonymity when you're talking about issues, when you're talking about civil discourse. George Orwell was ashamed of being poor. He published anonymously. Charlotte and Emily Bronte wanted to avoid gender bias. They published anonymously. Lewis Carroll was just a private person. He published anonymously. The Federalist Papers were published anonymously. People give to charitable organizations, including religious organizations, because their religion says you must give anonymously. Yet under Mr. Goddard's measure, he's going to say, I don't care what your religion says. If you want to support a cause anonymously, you can't do it anymore. And that is a serious constitutional infirmity.
Please, Mr. Riches, read the proposition. It does not do that. It only applies to political advertising. It does not apply to charitable contributions. You just conflated the C4s and the C3s. C4s do, in fact, do political speech and advocate for the defeat and election of candidates. So there are, in fact, ways that people hide behind these legal shields in order to basically fool the public. That's what's happened here in Arizona. It's time it stopped. And we have a Proposition 211, which in fact would require the individual or corporation that is making the statement to simply say, that's my statement, I stand behind it. You see it every day in terms of congressional ads where they have to say, that's my statement, I stand behind it, it was put on by me. We're essentially asking that apply to anyone who's in the public marketplace. And I think that's just basic fairness. It's basic humanity. It's been defended both on the left and the right. This is totally a nonpartisan operation. And it's something that is long past due here in Arizona, where we have more dark money as a percentage of the total political spending than any other state.
We have about 4 minutes left. And so I'm going to depart a little bit from our structure and say maybe a good thing to do would be for each of you in 1 minute to give a second summation of your case and responses to all the questions and everything else. We'll start with Mr. Riches.
Thanks. And I'd like to start by pointing directly to the proposition itself, 16973A6. The identity of each donor of original monies who contributed directly or indirectly is who this applies to. That applies to donors of nonprofits, C3s, C4s. That applies to issue advocacy organizations from the NAACP to the Sierra Club to Planned Parenthood. If we want to encourage free speech, this is not the measure to do it. We should not be punishing people who are supporting causes that they believe in. To the extent this reaches all of those activities, it is going to discourage public discourse. So what does that mean in practice? What does that mean to our viewers? A donation to Planned Parenthood or the ACLU becomes a public record. Membership dues to the NRA or Greenpeace are reported to the government and disclosed to the public. Even donors to a private arts group that wants to advocate for increased funding for the arts would be made public. Under this proposal, how many donations are going to be withheld and how much speech is going to be chilled?
Thank you, Mr. Riches. Mr. Goddard.
Well, somehow I thought we would actually talk about the proposition, and unfortunately, Mr. Riches has gone way off of the mark. This is a very simple requirement that money spent for a political advertisement, be it on the media, be it on the social media, wherever it is, if you pay for it, then certain disclosure is required. That's not required right now of dark money groups who spend tens of millions of dollars to try to persuade the Arizona electorate one way or the other, but never tell them who it is that's doing the persuading. And that's just wrong. And folks have stood up against it over and over again, but unfortunately not in public office. It's been a lot of regular citizens who are saying in numbers of over 80%, we in Arizona want to have transparency. We want to know who it is that's trying to whisper in our ear or shout in our ear, which is more likely. And Mr. Riches just equated full disclosure with punishment. I think that's absurd. All of us who are involved at all in political activity have been disclosing our political contributions for years, ever since I've been involved, and that's a long time. So, it's not punishment, it's responsibility. It's accountability. It's saying, I believe in this person or this cause, and I'm willing to stand up behind them. And as Justice Scalia said, that's the price we pay for this democracy. It's a noble price. Barry Goldwater, John McCain, an awful lot of very important Arizona voices join me in saying we need to have transparency. Please vote yes.
Thank you.
Prop 211.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Goddard. Thank you, Mr. Riches. This has been an illuminating conversation. I'd encourage our audience to go and read Proposition 211 and then vote. So thanks again for everyone for joining us. And thanks again to our two debaters. This was great.
Thank you, Liam. Thanks, Terry.
Thank you. Take care.